We are really, really honored, you guys, tonight to have Dan Orr. This guy, oh, this is my husband calling me. Hold on, I got turn my. Anyway, he has over 50 years of experience in the dive world. He was a U.S. Navy diver, and then he got involved in becoming the president of the Dive Alert Network, and got it, wrote a ton of books and booklets and training manuals and all that kind of thing. Got involved in various research projects, but he's kind of like the dive safety guy. And I tell you what, he's been honored by all kinds of organizations in the dive world, NOGI, all kinds of things. I mean, you take a look and really appreciate his bio that's in the newsletter. I've known Dan for a long time. He's a super cool guy. He's not only an amazing diver, he's like a rancher type guy now. He's out there, and we're just so excited to have Dan Orr. Please give a warm hand of welcome. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your patience. He's in a different time zone, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Debbie. I'm actually on Mountain Time. I live in Idaho at the base of the Tetons. And in fact, we've been getting a lot of snow over the last couple of days. In fact, there's about 2 feet of snow on the ground around the house right now, and more coming. But thank you all very much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. This, by the way, is the 35th webinar that I've done during the pandemic. So it's good to keep busy, good to keep active, and good to kind of keep sharing the information about divers and diving safety. So the presentation this evening is 5 mistakes that divers make. Sometimes when I do this presentation, it's listed as the 5 mistakes divers make, if it were only that simple. Because if there are only 5 mistakes, you simply don't do those and everything's fine. But these are what I think are the most important mistakes that divers do make that unfortunately can lead to injuries or fatalities. So first of all, let's talk about what an accident is. An accident is an occurrence or an event that interrupts normal procedure and or precipitates a crisis. And that precipitates a crisis is really important, because generally what happens in an accident is something happens, the diver acts or reacts to it and makes a decision, and sometimes that decision is not the right decision, which then initiates a cascade of events that results in an injury or a fatality. And I'll make sure here. So precipitates a crisis. Also, an undesirable or unfortunate happening that occurs unintentionally. And if you do like I do, I read accident reports and news articles about diving accidents regularly to try to figure out what happened and what caused that accident. And then sometimes it does appear as though it was intentional, but of course, no one would intentionally go out and hurt themselves or cause an injury to someone else. And it usually results in harm, injury, damage, or loss, casualty, or a mistake. And that mistake is what we're going to talk about through this presentation this evening. And as you realize, when you do read these accident reports, almost all of them are preventable. So if the diver would have simply made the correct decision or done the right thing, that wouldn't have led into that cascade of events that ultimately led to a fatality or injury. So this is a photo that was taken actually in 2018. I had the opportunity to dive in the Antarctic, and this is a wreck called the Governor Norrin. And the Governor Norrin was a whaling ship that caught fire in the early 1900s, and in order to save the whale oil and save the crew and the passengers on board, they ran it aground. So the bow, as you can see, is out of the water, and the stern is down at about 60 feet. And so diving in the Antarctic is, of course, a challenge, not only because of the cold, but because it's remote. And that's one reason why, if you do get a chance to dive in the Antarctic, all of the dives are limited to relatively shallow water. So no dives can be done greater than 60 feet. You can only do 2 dives a day, because we want to make sure if something happens or want to make sure nothing happens, because if something were to happen, it would take probably about 2 days or so to get back to Argentina. Well, scuba diving is inherently safe, but it can be, and generally is, very forgiving of mistakes. So why do divers make mistakes? They make mistakes because they have incomplete knowledge, and they don't have all the relevant facts to make the decisions that we have to make when we do a dive. And we are making decisions all the time. Sometimes you don't realize it, but everything you do as you go through the evolution of a dive, you are making decisions all along the way. Also, sometimes it's due to poor communication. And that is where divers do not share all of the relevant and important information with their diving companions. And a lot of times they don't even plan the dive together. I've seen situations where divers are together in the water, but they're actually on two different dive plans. So communication is extremely important, and you got to make sure that all of the people in your dive group all have a complete understanding of what the dive plan is going to be. And also changing conditions, because as we know, sometimes the conditions once you begin the dive are different than when the dive is over or during the dive. So these changes can create unfamiliar or unexpected circumstances that can cause stress and can cause the diver to sometimes make inappropriate mistakes. Time pressure. Time pressure is very important because a lot of times, especially if you're on a dive boat, people are pushing you to get in the water at a certain time. Sometimes you may be running a little bit late, and therefore you are pressed into doing things. Sometimes people want you to move more quickly underwater than you would want to. And I tend to be a very slow, very deliberate person when I prepare for diving and when I dive. For example, on the trip to the Antarctic, we were lucky enough to be on a Russian icebreaker that had a helicopter hangar on the back deck, but no helicopter. So we were able to use that heated hangar to get our equipment together before the dive. And I would actually go up there about an hour or sometimes 2 hours prior to the dive to get my equipment all together and make sure everything was the way it should be before I made the dive. Also, peer pressure. Peer pressure is very important because there are times when someone may want you to do something that you're not fully prepared for. In fact, when I, before I went to Dan, I worked at Florida State University. I was the associate dive safety officer there. And there was a young man who worked for us. His name was Sherwood Shiley, and Sherwood was a great young man, had a lot of potential, not only as a diver, but also as a college student and in his career field. And Sherwood was doing a very, very aggressive cave dive on the weekend with his friends, and they were going to extend the line that was in this very extensive cave system. And after the first day of diving, they'd gone probably 2,000 or 3,000 feet back in the cave system. And Sherwood looked at them that evening and he said, I just don't think I'm going to do this dive. I just don't think I'm fully prepared for it. And so I'm going to set it out tomorrow. And his partners actually convinced him to make the dive anyway, and he died on the dive. So don't let peer pressure make you do something that you're not prepared to do. Also, complexity. When I was going to dive in the Antarctic, I would be using equipment that I hadn't used before, equipment configurations I hadn't used before. So what I chose to do is I chose to go to southern Argentina a few days before the ship left Argentina for the Antarctic to make some dives using the equipment I would be using in the Antarctic to make sure I was fully comfortable with it, fully prepared on how to use it. And so I made a couple of dives in the Beagle Channel to make sure that I understood all the complexity involved in the equipment that we're going to be using down there. And of course, task loading, when you are doing so many things at one time that it really disrupts your ability to make clear decisions. So you want to make sure that you don't do too many things for the first time. So for example, if I'm going to a place I haven't been before, I very rarely will take a camera on that dive. I want to make sure I'm comfortable with the area and the equipment and the environment before I'll actually complicate things by bringing a camera with me. Also, I have what I call my rule of three. My rule of three is if I make 3 mistakes during my dive preparation, I rethink my readiness for that dive. In fact, in the Antarctic, when I was up in the hangar one day, 2 hours early, during my preparation of my dry suit and all the other, and the doubles we were using and everything else we were using, I made a couple of preparation errors. And so I made 3 and I decided, well, maybe it's not good for me to dive today. And I chose to sit that dive out. So if I make 3 mistakes, I will seriously decide whether or not I want to make that dive after all. Also, when divers make mistakes, and we all make mistakes, when a diver makes a mistake, they have the skills and knowledge to keep it from ruining a perfectly good dive. So mistakes are great learning experiences to make sure that we not only learn from that, but we share that information with others. So let's talk about managing risks. And you talk about risks in scuba diving. We all know that scuba diving is inherently safe, but a lot of people don't. For example, when there's an accident somewhere, it's splashed all over the media, all over the news media and the Today Show and USA Today and all of those, and they imply that diving is unsafe. So years ago, when Dan first started and we first started to offer insurance, one of the things that we wanted to do is we wanted to provide diving accident insurance for scuba divers, which we ultimately did. But when we first went out to insurance companies, we walk into an office and we say, we want to insure scuba divers. And after they stopped laughing, then we would say, no, we really want to do that. And they would say, is it safe? And we would say, yes. And then they would say, prove it. Well, the problem was we couldn't prove it. We couldn't prove it because we had a good idea of how many accidents take place every year and how many fatalities took place every year. But we had no idea what the denominator was in that equation. We had no idea how many safe dives were made. And you have to know that in order to determine what the incidence of injury is in scuba diving. So what we did, we actually at Dan came up with a project where we would send interns to various places around the diving world and collect information from dive computers. So we would download dive profiles and then monitor that diver post-dive and post-trip to see if there were any injuries that were related to the dives they made. And that way we could determine the number of safe dives that were made and determine the number of injuries from those safe dives. First thing we did, we sent interns to liveaboards. I mean, what tough duty they had. So they had to go to liveaboards, and during their time on liveaboards, they collected almost 20,000 dive profiles. And it turns out from that analysis, the incidence of injury was about 1 per 10,000 open water dives. And that is what we use as a baseline because we think that's about as safe as you're likely to be in recreational diving. And of course, it's that safe because people on the liveaboard are there for your benefit and to make your dive safe. So for example, you have dive masters that are there that give you all the information you need to know to make the decisions you and your partners have to make during the dive, so that you know everything you should know about that dive site. There are people there that'll help you understand the equipment you're using if you're using something that's brand new, for example. There are people who are on the boat and also in the water to make sure if something happens, they're there to help you. So it's really the safest type of diving you're likely to get. And there are also people there to keep you from doing stupid things like jumping in the water without your air turned on. The same thing goes for day charters, where there is an onboard dive master and dive masters that are actually in the water with you. So the same thing applies there. So again, it's 1 per 10,000 open water dives. Then we looked at people who are doing shore dives or charter boat dives where no dive master was on board, where you had to provide your own dive master and you had to get your own information. And also for people who had their own watercraft, all of that onus was on you. So you had to find out what it was about that dive site. You had to have all that information. There was nobody there to help you if you had a problem. There's nobody in the water that would help you if you had a problem, of course, unless you're a diving partner. So the risk was higher, and we collected about 16,000 dive profiles, and the risk was about 3 times higher, which somewhat makes sense because, again, all of that information gathering is really on you. Then we looked at dive professionals. Either are instructors or assistant instructors or professional dive masters or teaching assistants or whatever you want to call them. These are people whose role it is to teach you how to dive, to evaluate your skills, and to make sure you're safe underwater. And so we collected about 5,000 dive profiles, and the incidence of injury was about 10 times higher. And that makes some sense because they're doing multiple ascents and descents during skill training. If a guest, for example, has a problem, the dive master and the instructor may have to move very quickly up or down to provide them with assistance. So the incidence of injury is much, much higher. There are things you can do about that, though, to mitigate that risk. For example, when I worked at Florida State, we were training science divers almost every day. So we would take them out in the Gulf, and the bottom there was about 50 or 60 feet. And my staff were doing training dives almost all the time. And to make sure my staff were safe with all the training dives they were doing, I had them breathe nitrox using air dive tables, because that was before dive computers were very popular. And if we had dive computers, the computers were set on the air setting, even though they were using nitrox to give them a little bit of safety factor. We then looked at people who would be now called technical divers. These are cold water, deep wreck divers, and classically the New Jersey wreck diver. And we collected about 5,000 dive profiles, and you can see the incidence of injury was much, much higher because they're diving under the most extreme conditions, including depth and current and temperatures and doing work underwater and all these things. And the risk is significantly higher, but they also can mitigate that risk by using alternative gas mixtures, using alternative decompression profiles, and a lot of other things to mitigate those risks. So here we have a variety of different incidents of injury, and based upon on different things that people are doing during the dives. Now, fatalities, in the 2017 data that came from Divers Alert Network, there were 70 US and Canadians who died in diving accidents and 162 people worldwide. And when you think about that, out of the tens of millions of open water dives that are being made, could be hundreds of millions of open water dives being made, to have 70 fatalities and 162 worldwide, that certainly indicates that the incidence of injury, incident fatality, is extremely low. So according to Divers Alert Network, fatalities are one fatality in every 211,864 dives. So there are other things people do that are much more dangerous than scuba diving. And so what we're looking at here are sports deaths that are per 1,000 participants collected over a 5-year period. And the most dangerous would be extreme mountain climbing, or summiting K2, for example, one of the highest mountains in the world. And it's 104 fatalities per 1,000 participants over a 5-year period. And then there are things, for example, like
you might
base
question
jumping.
the sanity of these two guys who decided to pull off an illegal urban wingsuit stunt in Rio de Janeiro. As you can see, the men were Red Bull wingsuit daredevils. They actually successfully threaded the needle between two skyscrapers in Rio. One of the daredevils attempted to fly by one of Brazil's famous monuments. Unfortunately for him, that was his final.
That's kind of unexpected, but base jumping can be very dangerous. About 44 fatalities per 1,000 participants over a 5-year period. And then rodeo bull riding. I live in Idaho, and rodeo is probably one of the biggest sports here. In fact, all of the high school students here, most of them participate in rodeo. In fact, this is a photo I took at a high school rodeo when one of the cowboys got bucked off of a small cow there and did a face plant there in the arena. And it's 8.7 fatalities per 1,000 participants over a 5-year period. Hang gliding, 3.8 per 1,000. Skydiving, 3.3 per 1,000. ATV riding, where the wheels really do come off, 0.5 per 1,000. Scuba diving, way down the list, 0.06 per 1,000. And backcountry skiing, 0.05 per 1,000. In fact, I live just below a ski resort. I don't ski myself because I think it's too dangerous, but we live right below a ski resort. And a good friend of ours, who is a very well-known diver in the diving industry, lives about a mile or so from us. And one day he went up there to ski out of bounds, which is not necessarily a good idea, and ski out of bounds in the fog. And he was skiing along, and all of a sudden there was nothing below him. He'd skied off a cliff. And he wasn't seriously injured, luckily, but it's not a good thing to do. Okay, let's talk about mistakes. Mistake number 1, not practicing critical diving and emergency skills. When you look at the data from Divers Alert Network, 39% of the fatalities were people that were certified for 1 year or less, which, when you think about it, makes some sense because they have a limited amount of experience to draw from. They probably don't have a tremendous number of dives during that 1-year period, and so they may not have all the skills necessary to cope with circumstances that then resulted in a fatality. 35% of the fatalities were certified for more than 10 years, which is what I can tell you means absolutely nothing. It means nothing that somebody was certified for a period of time. It has nothing to do with their qualifications as a diver. It has nothing to do with the number of dives they've made. It's simply they've been carrying a certification card in their wallet or their purse for 10 years or longer. A significant number of the fatalities died on the first dive of their dive trip. And when I mentioned that in one presentation, some of the audience said, well, the thing to do is just skip that dive. It sounds like it makes sense, but it really does not. And when you think about it, what happens is that there are a number of people that are coming back to the sport from a long absence, where people were certified when they were in college, and because of family or career obligations, they weren't able to dive for a number of years. They wanted to then come back without refreshing their skills. And therefore, they really are no longer qualified to make the dive they're going to make. And in fact, in this photo, here's a guy who is entering without holding his mask in place to make sure his mask doesn't flood on entry. So this really concerns me because of return to diving post-COVID. And I'll talk more about that as we go through, but there are people who have been, like a lot of us, who've been out of diving for 2 years, maybe even longer. And we are going to go back to the water. And if it's been a long time, that could be a significant risk. In fact, in about 3 weeks, I'm going on a dive trip to Tasmania. And the first dive I'm going to make there is actually a shore dive with the dive store to make sure that I'm comfortable and my equipment is the way it should be and everything before we start doing any dives that are a little bit more aggressive. So let's talk about a case history, a perfect diving condition. This is Florida Keys, clear water, 100-foot plus visibility, 80 degrees, no current, no waves. A diver ran out of air at 60 feet of water. The buddy who was nearby attempted to share air. It was the second dive of the day. The diver and buddy were both found dead later on, and the buddy still had 1200 PSI in her cylinder. And so what is significant, whenever I hear about a fatality, especially a fatality in either shallow water or a fatality where somebody had air left, one thing I look at, was it the second dive of the day? The second dive of the day is very important because there are people who want to, for some reason, use a cylinder that they partially used on a previous dive. So that first dive, they used a part of a cylinder, and rather than waste that air in the cylinder or breathing gas, they decided to make a second dive on the same cylinder. And that, of course, can be deadly, and it certainly was deadly in this case. So the possible issues here: no use of a checklist or a pre-dive ritual before the dive, no pre-dive equipment check. And that would have made sure that the buddy knew that their partner was diving with less than a full cylinder of air. And no recent familiarity with critical skills, because the exchange of air obviously did not work. This is a photo I took when I was living in North Carolina working at Dan, of a guy who just came out of the water from a dive, and I asked if I could take his photo, and this is how he had his octopus, or his safe second, configured. And when you look at that, there's absolutely no way in the world that if somebody is in front of him giving the signal I'm out of air or want to share air, that he's going to be able to deploy that octopus or safe second quickly enough to satisfy that person's need for air. And what's going to happen, like happened in the other case, that diver who's out of air is going to reach and rip the regulator out of that person's mouth, and it's going to result in a double drowning. Now, one of the most important things I think Dan did was research a number of years ago that was published in 2008, where Dan reviewed nearly 1,000 fatality cases in the fatality database. And they reviewed 947 cases that occurred between 1992 and 2003. And the reason they used that period of time was because during that time, that's when we collected enough information to be able to determine what the causative factors were in those fatalities. And this was published in the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society Journal, and it was done by Dr. Petar Denoble, who was the vice president of research at the time, and is titled Causes of Recreational Diving Fatalities. And if you would like a copy of that article or a link to it, at the end of this presentation, I'll give you my email address. Send me an email. I'll be happy to share that information with you. So one of the things that they were able to do is to look at a series of events that went from the diver confronting a situation to the fatality. And the first thing that happened is called a triggering event. And when you look at the triggering events, the major triggering event is running out of breathing gas underwater. How can that be? I mean, we have technology, we have pressure gauges, we have integrated pressure gauges, we have a lot of technology that allows us to know at a moment's glance how much breathing gas we have. But still, 41% of the fatalities were triggered by people running out of breathing gas underwater. So here is that entire list: running out of breathing gas underwater, entrapment, equipment problems. I do a lot of analysis of diving related problems related to equipment. I don't think it's equipment problems. Equipment problems implies a design flaw with the equipment. I think it's problems with equipment. I am convinced that the major issue there is user error. So people are not using the equipment the way the equipment was designed, or they're not familiar enough with it to use it properly. Then rough water, trauma, buoyancy, and then inappropriate gas. So when you look at the more Dan data, this, by the way, is a photo that I dug up of me in 1969, a long time ago, and a lot of changes in that period of time. But this is data that says the number of years since initial certification. And again, you can see that there is a bump where people have less than a year of experience as a diver, and there are people who have more than 10 years. Again, that doesn't mean a whole lot because it just doesn't say anything about recency, about how recent their diving experience was, the quality of their diving experience, and so on. This is much more important. This is the number of dives in the 12 months prior to a fatality. And when you look, there's a bump here at people who have had 19 dives or less, again, because they have limited experience to draw from if something happens. And then you have a bump at the other end where you have people who have had more than 300 open water dives in the past 12 months. I mean, that's a lot of diving, and they still make mistakes. They still end up in the fatality database, partly because we think it's complacency, where they don't go through the same steps you and I do whenever we prepare for a dive. And therefore, they feel their experience will allow them to deal with anything, even though they haven't practiced those skills in a long time. So this is that, what I call cascade towards eternity, that came from that research report. You have triggering event, and a triggering event is something that happens during the dive. The diver makes a decision. The diver causes some action to take place. And in this case, that action makes the situation worse. It's called a harmful action. And then that harmful action just simply makes things worse, and it results in the diver being incapacitated due to some injury, and then ultimately the cause of death. Now, generally speaking, in the fatality database, the cause of death is simply drowning, because most physicians and most coroners really don't know what to look for to determine what the real causative factors were in physiological causative factors were in a diving death. And that's one reason why, when I was at Divers Alert Network, we were actually in our physician training programs, giving them a lot of information so they could really know what to look for when they're doing an autopsy. So if the diver simply makes the right decision, then this whole cascade stops right there. And if you think about the dives that you make, we're on a dive, you're going along the bottom, all of a sudden something happens and you deal with it and you go on, because we have a lot of experience to draw from, and we have the tools and knowledge to be able to make the right decisions. And so it doesn't then initiate that cascade that leads to a cause of death. So mistake number 2, not using a pre-dive checklist or consistent pre-dive ritual. Checklists are extremely important. Divers Alert Network and Patty and a few other groups got together a number of years ago. In actually 2012, we did a rebreather forum. And one of the major things that came out of that rebreather forum applies to not only closed circuit diving, but open circuit diving as well. And that is the importance of having a checklist. And the checklist is extremely important to make sure you don't forget a step that's necessary to be fully prepared when you get in the water. So another case history: diver attempted to put air in his buoyancy compensator during an emergency he was having. No air went into the BCD. He pushed the button, pushed the button, pushed the button, held the button down. No air went from the cylinder into the BCD. He had air in his cylinder. The diver ultimately drowned. Possible issues: BC inflator was not completely connected. So when he prepared his equipment before he got in the water, he put the two together, but didn't connect it fully. And all he had to do was push that button to make sure air was coming out of the cylinder into his BCD, but he didn't do that. And his partner didn't check that to make sure that that was also done. So the BC was not completely connected. There was no pre-dive equipment check done by the diving partners. And there was no use of a checklist or pre-dive ritual to make sure that everything was the way it should be before they got in the water. So checklists, there are checklists all over the place. You can find them, they're waterproof. You can find them online. You can find them for your iPhone or your mobile phone. They're all over the place. And there really is no checklist that fits everybody the same way. So I tend to make up my own checklist, because sometimes I'm using different pieces of equipment and I'm in different diving areas. So therefore, I make up my own checklist every time I go diving. Safety preparation. Prepare yourself and your partners and your equipment with a checklist and a consistent pre-dive ritual. Dive your recent experience, not your certification card. The certification card is only your admission to the sport. It has nothing to do with your skills. And as the graphic says on the right-hand side, recently practiced skills and experience are essential, because down here, your certification card means absolutely nothing. So dive your experience, not your certification card. Properly execute each dive as a buddy team, and prior to you getting in the water and during your dive planning, talk about contingencies. Well, if something happens, I would do this or I would do that, to make sure that if something happens, then you're somewhat prepared for it. Safety preparation, again, be situationally aware. This is one of the most important things you can do in preparation for diving. And situational awareness is making sure you understand your breathing gas and the fact that it diminishes during the dive. So that is yours and your diving companion. Make sure that you are constantly communicating during the dive to make sure that nobody is surprised that they're running out of breathing gas underwater. And understand your bottom time relative to your dive plan. So make sure your bottom time, elapsed bottom time is shared with other people in your diving group to make sure that you don't go over your dive plan. Make sure you're monitoring your depth and currents and visibility, your position, your location relative to your entry and exit point, so you don't have a long surface swim afterwards, and any overhead conditions that may change during the dive. We were in the Philippines pre-COVID, and there we were doing some shore dives, and it was extremely dangerous on the surface because of boat traffic. So even though we had a surface marker buoy, it made no difference whatsoever. So we had to treat it like a cave dive, use a third of our breathing gas going out, a third coming back, and a third in reserve. And in fact, speaking of overhead conditions, there was a double fatality in Mexico just a few days ago where 2 divers were actually run over by a dive boat and they were killed, even though they did have a surface buoy. Anything that could compromise your safety. So think about those things during the dive. So during the dive, you're thinking about these things to make sure that you're not surprised. And I don't like surprises underwater. So make sure you're not surprised and everything goes according to plan. So learn from each and every dive, and each and every dive should be, as I mentioned before, a learning experience and something you share with the people you dive with. That makes you a better diver, that makes a sport a better sport. So another thing here, safe divers don't waste a good mistake. So we all make mistakes, don't waste it. We learn from it and share that learning experience with others. And I don't hesitate to tell people that I screwed up because sometimes I do. And I want to make sure that I learn by that mistake and don't repeat it. Mistake number 3, not communicating effectively with your buddy or diving companions. Case history, diver in distress attempted to jettison his integrated weights. Unsuccessful because he didn't know how. This particular diver had been diving for a couple of years. During those couple of years, he had never put weights into nor ever taken weights out of his weight integrated BCD. It was always done by a dive master on the trips that he was on. All the diving he did were on trips, and the dive masters always put the weights in for him, always took the weights out for him at the end. So he had really no knowledge of how to work the weight integrated buoyancy compensator. And ultimately the diver drowned. Possible issues, no pre-dive communication with the buddy, because you and your partners need to understand how your equipment works. Before I get in the water, and I do travel a lot, and I don't always travel with a dive buddy. I get a dive buddy at the location I'm going to. I'll strike up a conversation, and during that conversation, I'll say, can I look at your equipment? I want to make sure I'm as familiar with my partner's equipment as I can be in case I have to help that person out in an emergency. I want them to be familiar with my equipment in case they have to help me out. So again, no pre-dive communication with your diving partner, no pre-dive equipment familiarization. On one trip, I actually did not take and could not take my buoyancy compensator, so I rented a buoyancy compensator from the liveaboard. And I'd never used that configuration before. And so my partner and I practiced for about an hour on how to quickly remove the weight pockets from that integrated CD. Ultimately, I chose not to use the integrated weights. I chose to use a weight belt because I felt it was easier for me to ditch the weights, easier for my partner to ditch the weights in an emergency. Incomplete buddy equipment check, as we talked about, and possible limited quick release options. So when you think about it, if you have an emergency, you have weight pockets, and weight pockets contain weights, and they should not contain more weight than you need. And I've seen situations where someone has removed one weight pocket, the other weight pocket still had enough weight in it to make the person negatively buoyant. So you want to make sure that you understand that this is a complex skill in removing those weight pockets. And if you think about that photograph you're looking at, just imagine that person is in the middle of a crisis and then having to use both hands to ditch those weights. So you've got to make sure that you've got the right muscle memory to remove those weights quickly in an emergency. Communicate. You and your partners need to communicate, and I think that's one of the most important safety things you can do. And also, if you need to bring a slate, you can write things and communicate in that way. So mistake number 4, not taking care of your health. When you look at the data, we've already seen the data from 1992 to 2003, those 947 fatalities. And again, the #1 triggering event was out of breathing gas underwater. This was done again in 2015 by Divers Alert Network, and things changed. So as of 2015, the #1 triggering event were underlying health issues. So about a third, in fact, in reality now, well over a third of the fatalities are generally the result of a cardiac event. So underlying health issues are a significant problem for divers today. Case history, 54-year-old certified advanced diver. He had an advanced diver certification card. It was his first open water dive in 7 years. So he had not been anywhere near the water in 7 years. When he entered the water, he had his snorkel in his mouth, not his regulator. So he entered the water, went underwater, took a breath, got a mouthful of salt water, and struggled significantly on the surface. All of that created so much stress, he became unresponsive and had a cardiac event. So the issues were been in a cardiac arrest. Partly he had no recent physical examination and no recent cardiac stress test, which he should have had. And also what he really needed was a refresher course. So if you've been away from diving for a long period of time, you need to make sure that you ease your way back into the sport, even though you've had a lot. In fact, I've had over 10,000 log dives. And when I go to Tasmania, I'm going to do a shore dive with an instructor and some other people there. And I'm going to ease my way into the water, since it's been a couple of years since I've been on a scuba dive. And I want to make sure that I'm comfortable with all the equipment and the environment before I do something a little bit more aggressive. So let's talk about cardiac issues for a little bit. And this data came from the 2019 annual diving report, which, by the way, is 2017 information, because it takes a couple of years for that information to be analyzed by Divers Alert Networks before it's published. So in 2017 data, autopsy results were available in 29 diving-related fatalities. In 16 of those, or 55.2%, the cause of death or disabling condition was identified as an acute cardiac event. So when you think about cardiac issues in diving, exposes divers' bodies to various stressors that may contribute or initiate an arrhythmia or an irregular heartbeat. And these major stressors are things like immersion, exposure to cold, increased work of breathing. When you think about it, that's diving. And there are things that we can do to mitigate those risks. There's nothing we can do about immersion because you're in the water. You can do something about exposure to cold by having the appropriate exposure protection. And when I was in the Antarctic, I had a dry suit, I had a polar weight undergarment, and I had dry gloves and so on. There were people there who also had heated gloves, heated undergarments, and everything else. So you can do something about your exposure to cold to mitigate that risk and reduce that stressor. Also, increased work of breathing. What you need to do is make sure your regulator goes to a dive store, to a dive technician who can make sure it is tuned properly so you're not doing a lot of work just to breathe. And then emotional stress. And emotional stress, it really is what worries me now with people coming back to the sport after a long absence. So getting back in the water, and some people want to go back at the same level they were at when they stopped 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years ago. And that is it does cause emotional stress. So make sure that you ease your way back into the sport to reduce all of these stressors, including emotional stress. So when you look at potential cardiac incident signs and symptoms, in fact, not too long ago, there was someone on the Good Morning America who was talking about having had a cardiac event, and her major symptom was jaw pain. And so it's not necessarily pain in the arm or pain in the chest. It could be almost anything. And about 25% of the fatalities had no signs or symptoms prior to the event, and they were totally unaware they had an impending cardiac issue. So first aid for a cardiac incident: remove the diver from the water. Of course, there's nothing you can do for the diver in the water. CPR and an automated external defibrillator if they're available. And I have that with an asterisk because AED availability may be limited at some dive locations. To me, it's like what we went through with bringing oxygen into the diving world. That was my job when I came to DAN in 1991. My job was to create the DAN oxygen program and the DAN oxygen equipment. And we had a hard time selling it to the diving industry because they were concerned about the requirement for training. They were concerned about legal ramifications. And it took a while for us to convince them that this was the standard of care, which it is now. The same thing really should apply to AEDs. When you consider the average age of the active diving community, which is well over 40. In fact, the last dive boat I was on, the average age was probably pretty close to 60. AEDs really should be something available at all dive sites. And of course, contact the emergency medical services in the area to help you out and help that injured person out. So safety considerations, remember, any sudden or noticeable changes in your health, whether it's mental or physical, you should seek a physician's advice and have a physical, an annual physical that includes a periodic cardiac stress test. In fact, I've scheduled my periodic stress test for Friday, and Friday I'm going to our local clinic here in the little town I live in to do my cardiac stress test. And I think annual physicals should be done for people over the age of 45, again, with a periodic cardiac stress test. And that physical really should be from a medical professional who is familiar with diving and I think this is very important, your life priorities. That physician should understand how important diving is to you, but it shouldn't be so important that you put yourself or other people at risk. So you got to be realistic about your health, but make sure that physician really understands that diving is an important part of your life. And if that physician is unfamiliar, your family physician is unfamiliar with diving, they can get advice from Divers Alert Network. So Divers Alert Network has a medical department that's there for your help. It's there for advice to your family physician if necessary. They'll share a lot of information with you. And also, if you don't have a physician who you want to go to, there is a DAN physician referral network that includes about 700 physicians all over North America in a variety of specialties. And Dan can give you contact information for a physician in that referral network. Safe divers should adhere to safety and conservative practices. The older I get, and I'm 74 right now, the older I get, the more conservative I get. Dive within your limits and your experience. And again, dive your recent experience, not your certification card. Avoid diving conditions that may exceed your recent experience or abilities. I personally recommend, especially for older divers, the use of nitrox with a dive computer set on the air setting or the use of air dive tables. Because if you use your computer on the air setting, breathing nitrox, which has less nitrogen, which is the offending gas in decompression sickness, that'll give you a little bit of a safety factor, but you have to understand the limitations in the use of nitrox. So therefore, and also it's used so frequently by older divers that it's got a nickname of geezer gas. And you can call it anything you want. In fact, I haven't made a dive on air in quite a long time. I don't intend to make any more dives on air. All of my dives are done on nitrox. So again, take a nitrox specialty course in order to understand the benefits and the limitations, because there are limitations in the use of nitrox as a breathing gas. Excuse me. Use the most conservative options. Scuba diving, of course, is indeed the sport that invented social distancing. But again, you remember you do have buddy responsibilities, I think, and therefore you shouldn't be too far away. Practice slow ascents, including safety stops. Now I put safety stops in quotes. I put safety stops in quotes because a safety stop is not a mandatory stop. It has become a part of our diving regimen now. But if something happens where you have an emergency, don't make a safety stop necessarily if you need to get to the surface. For example, there was a fatality in England recently, just within the last week, with a guy who was coming to the surface. He was low on breathing gas. He made a safety stop and ran out of breathing gas on the safety stop and drowned. So a safety stop is not a mandatory stop. It is certainly advisable. I make safety stops on every dive that I do, but if I were having an emergency, I certainly wouldn't make a safety stop on the way to the surface. So here you have me on the right-hand side there doing a safety stop. It's a trip I was on to the Bahamas, and the guy behind me, you can see my buddy is in the perfect lotus position. You can see that I'm not, because I'm not nearly that flexible. And that was Dr. Jose Jones. Dr. Jose Jones is the co-founder of NABS, the National Association of Black Scuba Divers. And Dr. Jones was 75 years old in this photograph. I was probably in my 60s when the photograph was taken, but he was a lot more flexible than I am. So be situationally aware. We talked about that, your breathing gas supply, your bottom time, your depth, your currents, visibility. position, location relative to your entry and exit point. Any workload is going to cause you to breathe more gas and absorb more nitrogen, and overhead conditions. So all those things are things you need to be aware of during your dive. And to me, it doesn't detract from the dive. It simply makes my dive a lot more enjoyable because I know things are going the way they should. Carry a safety and signaling equipment. And you can see actually the guy on the right-hand side, Bob Evans, the guy who created the force fin, and Bob and I were diving together, and that was his safety sausage. You see I'm using the Dan one. The Divers Alert Network one is different because when we created that, I made sure there was a metallic strip in it so it's visible on radar, and there's no other safety sausage or surface signaling buoy that has that kind of equipment. Or you can have a safety float, which is very important. And there are things, for example, electronic devices like something called a lifeline. The lifeline is made by Nautilus, and the lifeline is an electronic device that is waterproof. You come to the surface. If you don't see your vessel anywhere nearby, you push the button. What it does, it sends an automatic signal to the emergency channel to all the boats that are within about 15 kilometers that gives them a man overboard signal and gives your position within 1.5 meters. And in fact, it's something when I'm diving, in fact, when I go to Tasmania, I'm going to be carrying mine, and I do carry mine when I do dives, and it just hangs on your equipment. Take a break after multiple dives and multiple days of diving. On a liveaboard I was on not too long ago, they told us during the briefing that we could do 5 dives a day. If you want to do that's fine. I do not do 5 dives a day. I'll do a couple, and then I'll take the rest of the time and just enjoy and relax while I'm out there. But you don't have to do all the dives that are planned. And don't be afraid to ask for help, because if you're on a charter boat or a liveaboard, you are paying people to help you. So if you need help, by all means, ask for help. Have an easy exit ladder with a pull-up bar to make it easier to get back on board that boat. You can don and doff your equipment in the water if necessary, or you can consider different equipment options like side mounts to take the weight off your back, or use smaller cylinders, and a variety of different things to make it easier for you and safer for you to dive. Safe divers should not be afraid to say no. Remember, one of the most important safety things you can ever do is understand that anyone can call a dive at any time for any reason. All you've got to do is raise your thumb, the dive is over. That's the most important thing I learned in cave diving. The thumb comes up, no discussion, dive's over, everybody exits the cave. Same thing here, dive is over once the thumb is up. My partner and I, we talk about that before the dive, and it is understood that if I raise my thumb, or he or she raises his or her thumb, the dive is over, no questions asked. If returning to diving from long absence, divers should be realistic about your health status. Make sure that if you have a health issue, that you seek medical advice before you return to the sport. If you suspect or know you are infected with COVID-19, immediately contact your primary care physician. And when you are ready to go back to the water, consult Divers Alert Network. And there are other resources out there that can give you some information. For example, before returning to diving, there are articles and resources available for you to read. Dr. Doug Ebersol had an article in Dive Newswire about returning to diving after COVID. He had COVID, and he learned a lot from it, is sharing that information. He also has a YouTube video, Diving After COVID-19, with Doug Ebersol and Sean Harrison. And Dr. David Sharish has a YouTube video, Diving Medical Fitness in the Era of COVID-19, what every diver needs to know. Those things are also available on YouTube. So return to diving physical is important. Again, for physician familiar with diving medicine and your life priorities. And of course, you can consult the Dan Medical Department if necessary. And of course, continue to do our part, wear a mask. If returning to diving again from a long absence, you should refresh your skills and knowledge before you go back to the water. And a couple articles that I wrote. One is Return to Diving Cautiously. It was published in Dive Newswire, and I do have a link to that. If you want that, just drop me an email. I'll be happy to share that link with you. Or you can go to the Dive Newswire site and simply enter my name, and all those articles will come up. And it's important because if you've been away from the sport for a long time, diving involves, especially emergency skills, involve critical psychomotor skills, and those skills degrade over time. There's really nothing in the research about diving skills degradation. I looked everywhere. There's nothing out there. No one's ever done any research into that, but there is research into other psychomotor skill activities, for example, like advanced life support And paramedics have a decline in ALS performance after as short as 6 weeks from not doing those skills regularly. Nurses have a 70% decline in advanced cardiac life support after 3 months, an 86% decline after 12 months. And pilots have a significant decline in skills after 1 to 4 months. So all of these people involve, their activities involve complex psychomotor skills that do degrade over time. So refresh those skills and knowledge. Take a refresher course, dive with an instructor, dive with the club. I mean, you have a perfect opportunity because you have a great club. You have diving activities going on all the time. And so you can learn from other people and dive with other people around you who are experienced divers. Start diving with benign dives in places that are familiar to you. And of course, above all, be conservative. Mistake number 5, not accepting personal responsibility for your own safety. Case history: rebreather, CCR diver, boasted about superior knowledge and skill, and his CCR preparation was intuitive. He didn't need a checklist. All of this, he boasted about it the night before the dives they were going to make. The next morning, they went out to the shoreline. They found him in shallow water, unconscious, apparently unconscious. Of course, rebreathers is hard to tell because there are no bubbles that come from it, but he wasn't moving. So they jumped in the water, brought him to the surface. Luckily, they were able to resuscitate him and got him back up on the shore. The possible issues were not following preparation protocols, not using a checklist, and what he forgot to do was turn on the oxygen in his rebreather, and then not accepting personal responsibility for his own safety. So back in 1987, the diving industry launched what was called the Responsible Diver Program. Most people have long forgotten it. You don't see it hardly anymore. It was actually spearheaded by Dick Long from DUI. And it was something the industry embraced initially, and it was what they created was something called the Responsible Diver Code. Responsible Diver Code includes accepting responsibility for our own safety on every dive. It is our responsibility, not anyone else's. We have the ultimate responsibility for our own safety. We are to respect the buddy system or be trained and equipped to dive independently. And that's essentially being equipped like being in cave diving, where you have a lot of redundancy. Dive within the limits of your ability and training, especially your recent skills. Evaluate the conditions before every dive, and of course, make decisions for your own safety and the safety of the people you dive with. Be familiar with and check your equipment before every dive, and also be environmentally conscious. This is the Responsible Diver Code. This is something we should all live by. Also, there's another reason why accidents occur, and that is uncorrected bad or poor behavior or skills. There's something called normalization of deviance. This is also an article that I wrote and was published in Dive Newswire. And the concept of normalization of deviance was something I'd never heard of until the National Transportation Safety Board issued their recommendations from the disaster of the Conception. And I listened to all 4 hours of their report, which was absolutely horrifying. I'm sure a lot of you were equally horrified. But one thing they talked about was normalization of deviance, where someone deviated from standard operating procedure so frequently that it became normalized over time. For example, the Space Shuttle Columbia. When the Space Shuttle Columbia self-destructed, it was because the heat shields. They understood, they knew the heat shields were not necessarily reliable, but they launched the shuttle anyway, and they launched it again, and it worked until it didn't. And of course, that cost lives. And also the space shuttle itself, when it was launched in the cold weather in Florida, they knew the O-rings were not working extremely well in cold weather, but they launched and it worked, and they kept doing it until it didn't work. And again, it cost people's lives. So normalization of deviance is an extremely important concept in recreational diving. And what happens is when it does work, you are kind of rewarded when these deviations or shortcuts don't result in a problem. And so you continue doing it, and it works until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, there's sometimes catastrophic results. So these do become normal operating procedure over time, and you want to make sure that you are following the standard operating procedures and not deviating from those, which could eventually cause a problem. Again, poor decision-making, not taking personal responsibility for our own safety, poor preparation for diving, especially when returning to diving from a long absence. And what I'll do is give you a bonus mistake, not being insured or protected against loss. And we talked about that a little bit in the very, very beginning. Case history, 2 friends diving in an extremely remote area. Took them a couple of days to get there. One diver suffered a decompression sickness from an out-of-air emergency ascent from an extremely deep dive, well beyond 130 feet. And that person got a severe case of decompression sickness and was partially paralyzed. The evacuation and treatment costs, the medical evacuation alone was $89,000 from that remote location. The decompression sickness treatment cost was $57,000 for the multiple treatments that were required. So the total cost was $146,000. Of these 2 people, one was insured, the other was not. The one that was insured was not the one that was injured. So the person who was injured did not have insurance coverage, and therefore they ended up having to pay that out of their own pocket. So we talked about diving accident insurance briefly. When you think about it, average decompression illness treatment or DCS treatment in the United States is about $4,500 per treatment. In remote areas of the world, it can cost you $20,000 or $30,000 or more for the same treatment because they can charge whatever they want. So it's extremely important to make sure that you are insured against loss. Also, for one thing, where you live in Southern California is you have the ideal situation because you have the chamber in Catalina. Fantastic facility. There are chambers in other parts of the country that are no longer operating because of COVID, because the staff had to be shifted away from the chambers to work in the ICU or in the emergency departments. And there are chambers, for example, that have simply gone away. In the state of Florida, when I worked at Florida State, there were probably 20 chambers in the state of Florida. Now there are 2, possibly 3. And there are situations that I'm aware of where a diver was injured severely in southern Florida and had to be flown to Gulfport, Mississippi to get to an open chamber. And so this is another article that I wrote that was also in Dive Newswire about this crisis lurking below the surface about the emergency hyperbaric treatment availability. And insurance, Divers Alert Network has had insurance since 1983. It is probably the largest provider of diving accident insurance in the world. DiveAssure also has insurance programs, and there are others around the world as well. And there are some credit cards that do provide some of not only the evacuation coverage, but also some of the medical coverage, depending upon the credit card you have. So the thing is, you've got to make sure you plan. And if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. And that is a statement from Benjamin Franklin that applies to what we do in diving. You've got to be fully prepared for the dives we make to minimize your risk and maximize your enjoyment. And especially concerning if you are going far away from assistance. Houston, we've got a problem. So scuba diving safety is no accident. Now, I'm going to warn you, we have a blatant promotion alert that you're going to have to see here. My wife and I, Betty and I, just actually in the fall released a new book, which is 101 tips for recreational scuba divers. And there are actually more than 101. I realized I couldn't stop at 101. And it's an ebook that's available on Amazon and Apple Books, or you can go to wisedivers.com. Also, a number of years ago, I wrote a book called Scuba Diving Safety that's available from Best Publishing. And these are some of the articles that I had mentioned to you before. These are all available on Dive Newswire. So you go to their website and just put in my name in the search bar and all of these things will come up. And if you have any questions, I will hang around as long as you want. Thank you very much. And here is my email address. Okay, ask away.
That is absolutely amazing. Really, really awesome. Thank you so much. That was really great review. And I think,
and by the way, since my email address is down here, you can email me anytime. In fact, I get emails all the time from people who have been through the webinars, who something came to mind that they needed to have a question answered, or they needed to be directed somewhere, and I'm happy to do that.